All right, it's time for us to start our class. And I want to go back and make mention of something on page 83. Roman numeral 1 on page 83. He said the law was given to the Jews for the purpose of the civil government. And I want to go back and kind of shorten that sentence a little bit. The law was given to the Jews. And my first point then tonight would be that it was for the Jews. My passage, my proof is going to be Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Moses called all Israel and said unto them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ear this day, that ye may learn them and keep and do them. So there's three things then: learn, keep, and do them. And then in verse 2 it says, And the Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Now he's going to talk about who us is, okay? And the Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. Now, when you talk then, and verse 3 is where I want to make a key point then. He made not this covenant with our fathers. And if we look down in Deuteronomy chapter 5, you're going to find those 10 commandments given again. And that's what Deuteronomy means. It's the second giving of the law. And so in this then, and if you look at verse 13, verse 12, keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it. And then he talks about that. I think in Exodus chapter 20, he says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And so he words it a little bit differently here, but this meaning's the same. So he didn't make it with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He made it with those Jews who are there this day. All right. Then my second passage that I want to deal with is found in Deuteronomy chapter 7. You don't have your Bible.
It's not here, it's down in the corner.
Okay. In Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 1, it says, And when the Lord thy God, you got your telephone, you got one there. When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land whither thou goest to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee. And if you'll look, then he calls it the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Canaanites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. 7 nations, okay? Greater and mightier than thou. And so here is then what they're going to do, because God got fed up with, so to speak, with their abominations then and what they were doing. And so their time was up, and God is going to drive those 7 nations out. So that's 2 things that I wanted to talk about then in the beginning of our class this evening, because we're talking about those 10 commandments and making mention of those then in this. And now when we talk about some things then later on tonight, we're going to slow down a little bit as far as in our book, and we're going to talk about some things. We got over to page 111, and we have been traveling quite rapidly in this area, and that is because of some things there. And he talks about Origenian is, I think, the evidently correct division, and I will therefore make the basis of the few remarks I submit with regard to a wonderful document. Let us then notice a briefly but possible simply the main scope and the bearing of several precepts in order. Number 1, he says, Roman numeral 1, the first implies 2 things: that all men should worship and serve Jehovah. And that is true. All right. Number 2, that they should worship nothing else. That is also true. And then in Roman number 2, the second relates the proper mode of worship. Okay. That God should be worshiped in spirit and in truth. John chapter 4 and verse 24 is the passage. And when he's talking about spirit, he's talking about attitude. We've got to have the right attitude. God has always wanted us to have the right attitude. I think that's seen in Genesis chapter 4. I think that's seen also in Leviticus chapter 10. And then this is what he states in the New Testament. And truth then would be John 17:17, sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. So how God then has told us how to worship. We can't add to, and nor can we take from. There's those passages then in Deuteronomy, Proverbs, and Revelation that says we cannot add to, nor can we take from God's word. So it has to be then, and has always been, according to God's dictates, God's truth then. All right. And then in number 2, he says it is sinful to attempt to worship him under any material forms or images, and that's always been true. Then number 3, the third command also implies 3 things. That all men should speak of God.
Number 3 on the top of one. Is that true? That God cannot and will not suffer any of his glory to be given to anything else?
That's true. That is true. She talked about number 3 up here, that God cannot and will not suffer any of his glory be given to anything else.
I like the second sentence
there. The so-called divine jealousy rests on the security of the universe. And I think that's true. I think that is true. And that is involved with that. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. All right. That all men, then he talks about the third commandment, that all men should speak of God with the most profound reverence. And we have then the lack of that. And he's talking about all men everywhere. He's not talking about just the Jews, but all men everywhere. And we have people today who are using God's name in vain. They're using Jesus Christ's name in vain. And they're using it in many different aspects. They're even abbreviating it, OMG. That's ungodly. And so then we're going to go on with these. The fourth, then, Roman numeral 4, the fourth commandment implies then the prosperity and necessity of sanctifying to the Lord a portion of our time. And that's remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and that is true. And God wants, there's 168 hours a week, and it's pitiful that people can't give to God that length of time to worship him in spirit and in truth. When God says that's what he wants worship, and then people find that they can't worship him. And then some people want to make it, we don't have to do this, but 1 hour a week. And I think that's an ungodly attitude towards God.
Also want to make it entertaining.
Then we have problems with that one today. Number 5, Roman numeral 5, the fifth commandment applies that our parents are in authority and should be honored and respected.
And all in authority should be respected.
Yeah.
That means don't speak evil of the president.
And I think that is true. We need to honor our father and mother. Ephesians chapter 6 says that this is the first commandment with promise. So we need to understand that, and we need to make application and put that into effect too. I think these things are still, the principles are still valid today. And then the sixth commandment requires that we should use all lawful means to preserve the lives. And there's then abortion, that type of thing. The seventh commandment requires that all our thoughts, words, and actions should be holy, pure, and temperate. And be ye holy, for I am holy.
That's very cool.
And then the eighth commandment requires that we should use all lawful means to preserve the property of others. And that's
no stealing.
That's right. Thou shalt not steal.
No fraud.
Yep. Then the ninth commandment requires that we should use all lawful means to promote the reputation and good name of another person. All right. And then the 10th commandment requires that we should be satisfied with such things as we have. That's what the New Testament says. You know? So there's no need in us going out and stealing and doing all this kind of thing and having another man's wife and all that kind of stuff. All right. Over on page 114. Okay. At the bottom of the page. Now, he deals with this, and I want to deal with this too. He says that I need scarcely add that nearly all of the principles of the Decalogue are immutable and of perpetual obligation. The constitution of the Jewish theocracy, it has, of course, been abolished. And we'll deal more with that, but that is true. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, Galatians chapter 4, Hebrews 8, Colossians 2, and Ephesians 2. All right. They have been abolished, but this does not destroy nor in any way impair the moral principles that underline it. I think he's true there. And that are expressed by it and through it. The old Constitution of Kentucky, as such, was abrogated several years ago, and most of its principles have reappeared in the new Constitution, just as the Decalogue. A great moral principle is that this wonderful document have their foundations in the origin in the nature of God. So, we talked about those passages then that have stated that the old law was done away with. When we look then at our new law, and we are under the law of Christ, which is the new law, the New Testament, 2 Corinthians chapter 3 calls it the new law. And we find that most turn your Bibles to Romans chapter 13. And in verse number 9, he says, "For thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet."
Romans, I'm sorry.
13 and verse 9. Okay. Jesus also enumerates many of the 10 Commandments when he's dealing with the young man that comes to him and asks him the question, "Good master, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And that young man says, "I've kept these from my youth up. What like I yet?" And then Jesus tells him to go and sell all that he has. The thing about it is, though, in the New Testament, every one of them are named except one. And that one is, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So all of them are enumerated in the New Testament, but that one. So it is then essential that we understand the process, but we don't keep them because they're under the Old Testament. We keep them because they're in the New Testament and because they are divine principles. And when Hitler and those in World War II were being tried for their war crimes, they first had to establish what law were they going to use to judge him by, because according to the German law, he had broken no laws. So they had to go and prove that there is a higher law by which we are obligated. And that's how they convicted those men under then that tribunal.
I don't see anybody could condemn anything Hitler did.
Well, we are getting much into it by, he had genocide with that, and we get into our abortions and those type of things. We've killed more people than he has, and we're then need to make a stand on that. All right, now, we've talked about types and antitypes, I believe, before. And on page 117, we're going to talk some more about some legal types. We're going to talk about then the temple, or not the temple, but the tabernacle and some of the things that are in the tabernacle and the furnishings, and there's things. And we're going to deal with the types and the antitypes of some of those things, but we need to know some of this. And there's a reason why we need to know some of this. And he says, then the Bible represents God as being omnipresent. All right. And that's Psalms 137, I believe it is. 139. Yep, 139. Verses 8 and 9. And I thought that was 137. Let me look at that. We'll look.
9.
Yeah, I know. He says 139. And that may be correct. I may be having a senior moment. And I am.
Yes, it's 139.
Yes. And he notices 8 and 9. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, thy right hand shall hide me or hold me. Well, really, we need to start up before then. Verse 7, whither shall I go from thy spirit? Whither shall I leave from thy presence? If I ascend into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be a light about me. Yea, darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day, and darkness and the light are both alike to thee. So here is the omnipresence of God.
I think his omniscient knowledge too is verses 1 through.
Well, that's probably true too, but he's mentioning here is God being everywhere. And when we talk about then the tabernacle, and that's the next thing when we're looking at the 10 commandments and we're going chronology-wise, the next thing we're going to have to do is we're going to build this tabernacle, okay? Now, tabernacle is nothing more than a tent. And it is used in our New Testament. It is then in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, if the earthly house of this tabernacle be dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So this is a temporary dwelling place. And that's why David was upset when God's dwelling place was a temporary place and he was living in a house then, a more permanent house, and David wanted to build him that house then. All right, if we'll go down, it says to gratify these desires of the human heart. We're still on page 117. You see where I am?
Yeah. Last full paragraph.
Yeah. Therefore, evidently, one of the most benevolent objects for which both the tabernacle and the temple were erected. God's primary design in both cases was simply to furnish a house in which his presence and power and his glory might be manifested to the people. Okay?
Yes.
That's right. So we're talking about the tabernacle. We will mention some about the temple, but mostly we're concerned with the tabernacle at this time. On page 118 then, the top of the page, there was a place where Jehovah had recorded his name. A lot of times we say that's Jerusalem, but that's not so. Jerusalem was not that place until Solomon built. David made it the capital, and he brought the tabernacle then to Jerusalem. And then Solomon built the tabernacle or the temple there. But up until that time, it was not there. Matter of fact, Hebron was even the place. Then when you find Eli, and up to there, Samuel, and then after him, Shiloh was the place where the tabernacle was. So that makes it, that's where God's name was recorded. And so we have to be careful when we talk about them coming up 3 times a year. We used to say, and usually we say, in Jerusalem, and that's not absolutely true. It's where the name of God would be recorded, where the temple or the tabernacle, where the tabernacle would be resurrected. And so that's where they were to gather. We see that then in the 40 years of wilderness wandering. That 40 years, they still had to keep those feasts for those 40 years. It wasn't in Jerusalem that they went up to. They went where the tabernacle was. Of course, the tabernacle was in the midst of it because that symbolized the presence of God.
How long did it stay in Obed-Edom's house?
It wasn't long. That was on the process of getting it to Jerusalem. Yeah. He was probably there and close to Jerusalem. And if you look,
he was a priest, wasn't
he? Yes, he was. And if you go and look at where the temple was built, you're going to find then that the tabernacle was not far from that place too. When David brought it into Jerusalem, that's probably, it was there close. Couldn't build it right on top of it.
But when he brought it away from the Philistines had it, they had captured the Ark of the Covenant. That's
right. That's when that's long before David. No, David didn't. David was not the one who captured.
They brought it back.
No.
Where was he bringing it from?
Well, wherever its resting place was, he was bringing it to, and that's when Uzzah touched the hand of it.
During the travel.
Yes, right. You got to understand that when Eli's sons, then Eli was killed, fell down backwards and fell down dead, and his 3 sons were all died that day. Mm-hmm. And then you'll find, and see, they wanted to carry the Ark of the Covenant into battle, and they did, and then that's when that took place. His 3 sons were killed, and then Eli fell backwards and died, and the Philistines captured the
that's before David was king.
That's right, Ark of the Covenant, and they carried it into Dagon's house.
Yeah, and Dagon was destroyed.
Okay, and then they loaded it on a new cart, and they brought it back because of what?
That's when Uzzah reached out.
No, see, there's a time span there, because you're talking about, like you said,
Uzzah's with David.
That's right, and this was before David.
Okay.
All right. Now, this is even before Saul became king.
Well, they even had a king.
That's right.
All they had was the judges.
That's right.
Okay.
All right, because here's Eli, and he died, so then Samuel is going to be the next judge. And so he is the one then.
He's the last.
That's right. So here are they bringing in, then they bring it back on the cow and the calves and that type of thing. And come back, and then that's when the Israelites look into it, and there were several that were killed because they looked into it, and they had no right to look into the Ark of the Covenant.
Right. They got melted like the dinner altar.
And I think when you some of the things that took place there, they may have handled some of those things that
handled wrong.
Like we don't have any mention of the Aaron's rod that budded. Or the manna.
Just the tablets of stone were in there.
That's right. And so they may have defiled those 2 things, and thus why they were killed. Now, we're not really told, so that's some of my supposition there. And that's
going to get straight.
But yes, and I appreciate you doing that, because we have a time difference there.
Yeah, and I know there's a time difference when Solomon became king and he built the temple. He built his own house first.
Yeah, like 7 years into his kingdom.
Okay. How long was the temple before Nebuchadnezzar came along and tore it up?
Solomon, it was...
Solomon reigned for 40 years. So
right.
If he was 7, it was 33 years that he was king.
But the temple continued on for a number of times then. Then
Who is that? Turn it on.
Here, go answer this. There. Oh, he hung up.
What was it?
I don't know. I'll have to. Anyway, I should have turned it off and I did.
Keep mine turned down all the time.
So we were talking about the time. You asked the time period between.
How long did the temple exist after Solomon?
If Solomon, let's
Did
see.
Solomon die at the end of his reign?
Yes.
So it was 33 years
Yes.
that he was king after the temple was built.
And let's see.
And then you got Jeroboam and Rehoboam.
Right. Give me some time to think about this.
Okay.
975, I think, and I can't remember. That's when the kingdom divided.
And I know when the temple was destroyed, the next one was Herod's temple, right? It's not Solomon's temple, it was Herod's temple.
Well, there's Zerubbabel's temple, and then there's Herod's temple.
Oh, okay. I like
And
I'm gonna name the next cat.
It was, I think, 11. I forgot when. Let's just say that the temple, the temple was probably like 400 years. I'd have to get.
Really? That long?
Yeah.
Wow.
Uh,
Let's see what Google says. Since everything on the internet's true.
But I think it's going to be, it may be a little less than that, but it's going to be somewhere around in that time. Now, you've got to understand that they took a lot of the gold off of it, but to pay a tribute to others and that type of thing.
410 years according to Google.
How much did I say?
400. They said the Babylonians destroyed it in 587 or 586.
Yeah, well, it all depends on your...
Rabbinic literature says the temple stood for 410 years.
Yeah. Okay.
That's according to the work of Seder Olam Rabbah.
All right. So that's pretty close. About 400.
Sure.
All right, so we're talking about then the symbol. Let's see.
It took him 20 years to build it.
There was a place. No, I don't think so.
That's what it said there. That's Google. They're right.
There was a place where Jehovah's. Okay. There are symbols of his presence and of his power and of his glory that had been promised to meet with them. All right. Be it remembered that these things are also written for our instructions in our comfort. Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. Whatsoever things are written aforetime are written for our learning, that we through patience and comforts of the scriptures might have hope. He left off the hope there. So we're going to talk about that Old Testament, and you've got to understand then that passage in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. That is a key passage. All right. And so we're going to talk about legal types for a while. And I think this whole section is going to deal with legal types, the beautiful pictorial outline of the Christian system. It's a most conclusive proof of the divine origin of the whole Bible. And I think he's true. I think this, to me, it begins to show us that this thing was not done in a corner, and it just happenstance. God planned this thing out. And it shows that the mind of God. These two reasons alone are sufficient to make the study of the legal types a profound interest. Okay? And I think that's what it is. Now, we're going to talk about the tabernacle. It was a tent. It is called also the tent. It is also called the tabernacle of the congregation. The tabernacle then of the appointed seasons for the meeting of the congregation. It's called the tabernacle of precepts or witness. It's called the house of the Lord. It's called the sanctuary. It's called the holy. And it's called the temple of Jehovah. All right, now notice the next point. The next paragraph, the materials of the tabernacle were all free will offerings. Exodus chapter, what's taking place in Exodus chapter 31, 32, 33, and then 34, 35, and this type of thing. But you have the children of Israel then building the golden calf and it being destroyed, and then Moses going as a go-between, a mediator between God and them, and then satisfying those requirements, and God's grace being bestowed upon them. And then the next thing you see is God asking them to give. And in this is a free will offering. And they give so much because they understand the grace of God that they are asked to cease in their giving. And when we're dealing with giving, then the first thing we need to deal with is with the grace of God. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, he deals with this. And I think this is a good place. When you're talking about giving, I think this is a good place to start. Moreover, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed upon the churches of Macedonia, that in great trial of affliction and abundance of their joy and deep poverty abounded the riches of their liberality. For to their power I bear record, and yea, beyond their power they are willing of themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And this they did, not as we'd hoped, but first gave of their own selves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. It talks about their deep poverty. When people understand what God has done, go back to verse number 1, the grace of God. When they understand the grace of God, giving will not be a problem. And that's what they did. They understood the grace of God. And then God asked them, I need to build this tent. And they gave a free will offering then. These then came from the Egyptians. They had borrowed them. When we talked about that, I think last week, about borrowing them. And it was the different type of borrow. They had no intentions of giving it back. That's not what the word even that was used makes a distinction then. And so they gave, and here's some things that they gave. They gave gold. Now you figure this is what they got then from the Egyptians. They gave gold, silver, copper, then blue and purple and scarlet fabrics, fine linen, goat's hair, ram skin dyed red. And then he talks about Tarshish, I guess, skins.
So some kind of leather they did.
Yes, I think some translations have this as dolphin skins. And there is some problems with the translations, that type of thing. Maybe close to a beaver type thing if you could do a little research on that. Acacia wood. And he gives the little asterisk there on page 120 down at the bottom. There's a large tree grown in Egypt and Arabia, from which the gum Arabic is obtained. The wood is exceeding hard, and when old, it resembles ebony. So it's a dark wood, and it has to be a hard wood. Why God used it and that type of thing, yeah. And we'll talk about those things. Let's see. There was then the oil for the lights, the candelabra, or however you want to say that. The spices for the anointing oil, for the sweet incense, the onyx stones, and there are other stones then for the ephod and the urim and the thummim. So there are all these things. And then they give the estimate. And understand, I think this is a very conservative estimate, even by today's standards. It's $1,101,100. I think that's way short of what
the whole Ark of the Covenant itself is coated in gold.
Well, some of it is made out of pure gold.
Yeah.
Okay.
The cherubim and all that.
Yes. The mercy seat and all that's on there.
Gold.
All right. The walls of the tabernacle are composed of boards, planks of acacia wood covered with gold, and each plank then was 2 cubits long. You're not going to be held responsible for these things, but it's good to know then some of these things. The thickness of these planks were not given in the text, but according to Jewish traditions, each plank was 1 cubit thick. That's 18 inches.
That's a heavy piece.
That's right. That's why they had carts. Those children of Israel that were to carry this had carts because it was so heavy. The sons of Kohath had the most holy things and they carried them upon their shoulders. But everything else, then they got to carry it on carts.
But only the high priest, he had to cover the Ark of the Covenant.
That's right.
Before they could remove it.
That's right. All of these articles were covered.
But only by the high priest.
Yes, he went in and covered then in the holy place. And then he went into the most holy place. And most times I think he backed in because he could only enter in it once.
Somewhere I read that in the Bible. He backed in.
And he had back in, and then he covered and then they could come in. Now the staves then were reached out, and that's how they had to cover, how they had to carry it. Okay, and then that's why when you get into Uzzah, the last time the ark, we find that the ark was carried. Now that's where you're getting your Uzzahs, and the last time the ark was carried was on a cart. So here's David putting it on a cart, and David should have known better because the kings were required to write the law in their own hand. So he should have known better and he should have known how to carry the ark. And he didn't carry it that way. He thought, well, here's the last time it was carried. I'll carry it this way. And then Uzzah, then in all good conscience put forth his hand and was killed because of that. And say he should have known because Uzzah was also a priest. Obed-Edom was a priest too. All right, so these are not then, no, it's not a 2x6 or a 2x8 then. Okay, and so the Septuagint then calls them pillars. The internal dimensions then of the tabernacle were 30 cubits in length, 10 cubits in breadth, and 10 cubits in height. The external dimensions then were 31 cubits in length, 12 cubits breadth, and 10 in height. The foundations of the wall were 96 sockets of silver, each socket being equal to 1 talent, or 93 3/4 pounds. That's some heavy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Huh?
That's the next word is avoir du bois.
Whatever
that means.
He estimates the weight of Hebrew shekel at 9 pennyworths, or 2.4 to 2.7 grams, troy weight, which is about half an ounce.
Of avoir du bois.
Okay, and hence, according to the doctor's estimate, the shekel is worth about 50 cents. So anyway.
Yeah. Is he British?
Who? No, Robert Milligan was, but he probably had a lot of
the British Empire.
Yes, because he was during that time when America, there's the education system was coming. The walls were supported by 5 bars made of acacia wood and covered with gold. Okay, the coverings of the tabernacle were 4. The first then were composed of 10 curtains of fine twine. Then he talks about that. Then he gives the length of these coverings, and all of this is important. I'm not going to
hold us to the numbers.
No, and there were coverings then of this. Now on page 122, now we're getting into some meat. Okay. Now the tabernacle had to face, the opening was always east. Okay. So when you look at the section then of maybe a diagram, it always open in the east. The whole tabernacle was divided into 2 east and west rooms by a partition veil. All of this is important. Okay, the veil is important, and these 2 rooms are important. Okay, and he talks about what they were made out of, the veil, what it was made out of. Now, notice how tall was the tabernacle to be? Was it 10 cubits? So,
10 in height, 30 in length.
Okay, so if it's 10 in height, and so
that would be 15 feet.
Okay, so when we're talking about this veil then that was between these 2,
it was very heavy.
And it was also because, notice, it was made of the same material of the innermost curtain and was figured and broadened in like manner. It's suspended directly from the golden clasp with the curtains from gold hooks attached to the 4 pillars of acacia wood, resting in 4 sockets of silver of 1 talent each. So, that's right. So when Jesus died and the veil rent from top to bottom, that is significant. Okay? And so all of these things have their representation. And we'll talk about them, and that's what we're going to talk about in this section then. Okay? He talks about the doorway then, hangings and that type of thing. All right, at the bottom of the page, the primary design of the tabernacle, as before said, was to furnish a house for God, but as God dwells both in heaven and among his people on earth, it is fit that the tabernacle should be divided into 2 rooms or apartments, each having its own proper furniture. Okay, and accordingly, then we find, so we're going to talk about this, that the most holy place of both the tabernacle and the temple were a type of heaven. You'll need to know these. The holy place then was a type of the Christian church. When he's talking about Christian church, and then he's talking about the church you read about in the New Testament. He's not talking about what we think of as the Christian church. He's talking about
the church.
Yes. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, it mentions the house of God. In Isaiah, let me read Isaiah, Jeremiah, Isaiah 2. All right. Verses 2 and 3. And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it. And many people will say, go and come, let us, shall go and say, come ye, let us go up into the mountain of the Lord's house, to the house of God of Jacob, the house of God. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15. But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of truth. Okay? So here is a prophecy in Isaiah 2 of that church, and we'll talk about that later on. But here's some things then that we need to know. But here's the house of God being prophesied that it would be built. And so that holy place then, the most holy place represents what?
Heaven.
All right, and the holy place then represents what? The church. The partition veil then was a type of Christ's body.
That makes sense.
What?
That the partition veil was a type of his body.
As
he died,
well, I didn't. I've kind of hit on that, but I didn't mention that exactly.
Yeah, but I mean, it makes such sense to think that, he was torn asunder, so was the veil.
Yeah, the veil was torn asunder, so when he
opened it up to all.
That's right. And hence, when his body was pierced and the veil was rent, Matthew chapter 27, verse 51. The gold and the silver and the fine linen seem to denote merely the great value and purity of all that is in God's presence. The cherubims were symbolic of the presence and the ministration of angels. And the angels did have something to do in the giving of the Old Testament. And that's found in Acts chapter 7.
Hebrews 2.
That's right. Hebrews chapter 2. For the things spoken by angels was steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received the just recompense of reward. How shall we escape? All right. Before we bring this section to a close, it may be well to notice a few points of resemblance and contrast between the tabernacle and the temple. Okay, number one, we find that the walls of the temple were built of stone, wainscoted in cedar woods, covered with gold. Okay. The ceiling was made of cedar woods covered with gold. And that's why then when Israel later on, when Israel got in trouble and needed to pay tribute money to certain kings, they went into the temple and they started scraping off this gold. The floor of the boards covered with gold. The dimensions of the temple were 60 cubits long, 20 broad and 30 high. Again, I'm not going to make you know that, but the most holy place was a complete cube of 20 cubits. It was, and here that the cube was used among the ancients as a symbol of perfection. I think that's pretty interesting. All right, the general design of the tabernacle and the temple was the same. That's all you'll need to know. So when we refer to the tabernacle, it's the same difference, okay?
It was actually set up the same way.
Yes.
Just maybe larger than the temple.
May have
It was
when he got into the candelabra, there were like 10 candelabras. There was more in the temple than
about the size of the temple was bigger than the size of the tabernacle.
But the next, let's see, the symbolic furniture of the tabernacle. In the most holy place, we find the Ark of the Covenant. In the Ark of the Covenant, we find the tables of stones. We find the mercy seat, the cherubims, the golden censer, and the urn of manna. And Aaron's rod that budded. Okay, the mercy seat sat on top of it, as did the cherubims. And the cherubims then had their wings and they faced inward over the seat of the mercy seat. That was the covering of the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, but those were all. In the holy place, we find the altar of incense, and that was right before the veil. The table of the presence, the table of showbread, way I always. And he calls it the golden candelabrum. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about each one of those. All right, the Ark of the Covenant was a sort of chest. It was 2.5 cubits long, a cubit and a half broad, and a cubit and a half high. You got to know that it was a chest. Okay? But it was an empty chest. I mean, because the mercy seat is a different symbol, and it was sat on top of that. But this is the Ark of the Covenant. Okay?
Right. And that acacia wood.
All right, and it was overlaid both within and without with pure gold. Around the upper edge was a rim or cornice of pure gold. I think in my reading, it talks about being a crown. So as you think then, a crown, around somebody's head, this was a crown all the way around this thing.
It's probably sculpted.
Yeah. And then on two sides, on each side were two rings of gold. Okay, so two sides you have rings of gold.
No rings, you mean like open rings? That was to put those pieces of wood.
Yep. The Acacia wood.
Whatever they made the poles out of.
Acacia wood.
Okay.
And then
Staves,
they were covered with gold for the purpose then of bearing the ark. They never, once they were put in, they never left the ark.
Oh, really?
That's right.
So they would just go in and pick it up. It always stayed in there.
That's right.
Okay.
See, and that's how then after the high priest went in and covered this up, then here would be the other priests, those selected would carry it on their shoulders. You'd have
but you're saying
4
the
men.
Never left it once it was put in.
That's
the
right.
First time it was made.
That's right. We never hear of it leaving. All right. Then in the ark, then was the tables of testimony, the 10 commandments, the pot of manna, and Aaron's rod that budded. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 4. It seems from 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 9 that the pot of manna and Aaron's rod had both been removed and probably lost before the building of the temple, which was about 486 years after the building of the tabernacle.
But was it replaced?
No, those things were.
So when the ark was placed in there, it was the real ark. It wasn't a duplicate when it was placed in the temple.
That's right.
But it only had the tablets.
That's right.
Okay.
And that's what I'm telling you. When the children of Israel opened the ark of the covenant opened, I think they defiled then those two things. That's just my opinion. Okay. And that's when those things then are no longer existing in the ark of the covenant. All right, let's take a 10-minute break.
Do you want kind?
Yep.
What kind you want?
Don't care. Bless you, my son.
Thank you. Now, where did they get all this gold from?
From the Egyptians.
From the Egyptian.
They had that much? I don't think I gold from the Egyptians, bro. My
Yeah.
goodness.
Yes. Gold is not as scarce as what we want to make it out to be.
Yeah.
It is precious.
They
but
kept giving them everything so they'd leave. Get out. God, it's a lot.
So they'll let me get a little heat wave, huh?
Mm-hmm. Typical of the South. Never put your capris and your flip-flops away. But don't put your sweaters away in the winter either.
Yeah. It's still in the 30s up north. Let me see.
Well, they can have it.
Oh, it's 58 degrees in Philadelphia. Whoa.
Come on.
It's 58 in Philadelphia.
Wow. It's probably warmer there than it is here.
Well, it's supposed to be 65.
It's so warm out today, I thought, well, I'll put them on. Sugar it up.
I know. I had gotten some, you know what wandering Jew is? It's a plant.
Mm-hmm.
It's purple. You know, it has pretty little lavender blooms on it and everything.
Okay.
So I had gotten some from one of our church members. She said, come and get all you want, because she said she just had a little bit and it just spreads like wildfire. And it loves where she's got it planted. So I went over there and got me, you know, and I put in a pot. And I put it in the pot. It did wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it dies back in the wintertime. And I looked out there the other day. It's full of either daffodil, but the little green things, they're sticking up. Their little leaves are sticking up. And I can't tell from the leaves if they're daffodils or what they call lily of the valley, which is like a little lily bells. They look like little white things. They're beautiful. They smell really loud.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't, the whole bucket's full of them now. And so I guess when I got this, I got some, I wonder, I keep forgetting to tell her, Do you know you've got bulbs planted right there? Because I don't know where they planted, when they built their house, it may have been an old home place, years and years and years ago.
Do y'all have a front lawn in your house, in front of your house, or anything like that?
We got 4.25 acres.
Oh, shoot. So you got.
We got 2 barns and,
Oh, so you got a big, huge property.
4.25 acres. It's almost a perfect square. It's like 500 feet.
Is that what they
500
were looking for, or you just happened to come across the
I
capacity?
happened to come across it. We got, went to look at a house, when we moved to Grove. We got this, we saw a house for sale, called the real estate agent. And she took us to this house, and it was a foreclosure. And it wasn't that bad. You know how some foreclosures, they beat it up pretty bad.
Yeah.
But this one wasn't that bad. It needed a little bit, but it wasn't that bad. But it had the most awful yard. It was like a little bitty front yard, and then it went downhill, and then it leveled off. I mean, it had almost 2 acres because most of it was going downhill, and then it had like a flat spot. And Keith has to have a workshop. So anyway, then she told us about this house, and it actually is closer to Macon. So we're out there on the Ballin Freeway, literally on the Ballin Freeway. But yeah, it was. So she showed us the house, and it's not a big house. It's like
Let's try that.
Do this one.
it's like right at 1,800 square feet. I don't have
There
a.
was a church with a preacher and song.
I caught my she shed out in the back. That's where I store
Again,
my.
spill over in the
Yeah.
rest.
And
One
then
week preacher
the house
preached
was
on
really well built, like the bottom of the house built with 2 by 10.
commitment. Hold on a minute.
It's siding, so we.
We preached on commitment and how we should
It had
dedicate ourselves to
carports. We
service.
enclosed
So
the
we were
garage.
saying, I shall not be moved.
I have pictures of it.
The next Sunday, the preacher
And-
preached on giving and how we should gladly give to the work of the Lord. Later then led the song,
We
Jesus paid it
painted
all.
it. After, of course,
You
we
heard
added
that?
on to, I mean, when we enclosed it, we used the same siding. Then we had
Next
some
Sunday, the preacher
old
preached on
pictures.
gospel and how we should watch our tongues. So
Is it
we
a
heard that
rancher?
song. I love to tell the
That's what
story.
I can't handle it.
Preacher became very disgusted over the situation. The next Sunday, he told the congregation he was considering resigning.
So that's my
Some
one.
leader said, oh, why not?
Your grass is beautiful.
I had to go.
So he came past preacher resigning. Next week before the church that
Take care of
it
the
was
grass.
Jesus led him there and it was Jesus that taken him away. So
Well,
he
we
was saying,
can't, and of course, I
what a
was
friend
too
we
big
have
to
in
have
Jesus.
Yeah.
a sprinkler system. So
Well,
this
that's
is
right, when you get up
we
there, this is not
enclosed,
happening.
when we
We
enclosed the
talked about it in
carport into
school.
a garage,
When you get up there,
Right there?
you know your truck, and the long.
That's
when
an
the-
hour,
when some leader gets up,
door.
it's ready to.
yes, it's a garage door,
Okay.
insulated garage door. And at the very back,
That
it's
is
a
exactly
walk-through door. And we had to kind of work around with stuff that was there. It's got tons of brick walls around it,
Oh,
where they've got all these big azaleas.
Anyway, I thought that's.
Yeah, this is in our backyard. That's me and my girls.
Interesting.
And it's our backyard. That's the closest house to us.
ooh. Shoot, I'm gonna have the church picnic there.
We have parties there.
Mm-hmm. So y'all do the landscape, or you do the landscaping work?
Do it all.
We pulled up all the bushes in the front because it was those boxwoods, and they started dying, like the back half of them and all. So
I've
we
got-
pulled them all up.
I've got a front end loader, yeah. I can do
He's got
that.
a tractor. We pulled them all up. Now we're
Tiller,
hawthorns. Have you ever seen hawthorns? They're beautiful.
That's some work taken care of, landscaping, take care of the ground. You know?
Mhm.
cut the grass.
Cut the grass takes us all day. And we have 2 mowers.
She's got a ZTR and I've got a tractor. I've got 60-inch cut and she's got a
48, 54,
52,
52
whatever.
They both ride on track.
at the same time.
So she's,
I can get close to the house. I don't have to do any weed eating because we got a ZTR.
so she does that and I do the big stuff.
Good way to get your tan too.
He doesn't worry about the tan.
Well, see, I have to because
You put a hat on?
Yes, I do.
You just,
he does because he's had melanoma on his face.
But I've also got a cover over my tractor.
But you know something, I found out that doing the lawn work, I get more tired from that than regular working out, like I mean, drain, you know, the heat, it drains you.
Yep.
I agree with that, 100%.
All right,
Gotta paint my little shed.
it's time to get back.
We built in my wood sheds in the back.
All right, so we talked about the Ark of the Covenant. All right, now, on top of the Ark of the Covenant, we talked about what was in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark then, on top of the Ark, was the mercy seat. Now, if you look in the book,
This book or the Bible?
this book, he's got the Vulgate, and then he's got that Propitiatorium.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it has to do with propitiation. When you see propitiation in the New Testament, it's got something to do then with the mercy seat. It's a covering.
Oh, wow.
And so there is some, that's why when we talk about this then, and there is the Shekinah, we'll get to the mercy seat or the Shekinah. There is also some significance in the New Testament. This, the mercy seat, was composed wholly of pure gold. Now, gold is not only expensive, but also it is heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very
Soft
soft, yes. That's why your rings
or ginger.
or your glasses, when I was in the optical business making glasses and I had to deal with old glasses, they were very easy to bend because of the rate of gold that was in them. And they've gotten less and less. Rings are mostly 10 carats now. They used to be 24 carat. When you got that, they were very pliable, very bendable, and that type of thing. So this is pure gold, though. And it's heavy. So, all right, on the two ends then of the mercy seat sat the same piece of solid bullion. Was formed two cherubims with extended wings and having their faces towards the mercy seat. Okay. And then in Solomon's temple, there were two colossal size. Each one of them was 10 cubits high and had wings extending 10 cubits. So, and if I remember correctly, they went from side to side. So they were 10 cubits. This thing was 20 cubits then in the temple. And these things went from.
Well, it says each one of these were 10 cubits. That's 15 feet.
Yeah.
It had wings extending 15 feet. Those were gigantic.
Yes.
And these were added into the temple?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Now the Shekinah. Between the two cherubims and on the mercy seat was the Shekinah. This is the symbol of God's presence. The word is not used in the Hebrew text as common in the Targums and the Jewish literature. It is derived from the Hebrew word to dwell, and hence primarily means a dwelling. But as it seems to have always been bright and luminous, it came also to signify the divine glory, which by the means of which the holy place of the tabernacle in the temple was illuminated. To this, Paul refers then in Romans chapter 9 and verse 4, when he speaks of the Israelites, he said, to whom pertained the adoption and the covenant of the giving of the law.
It says, and the glory.
And the glory. That's right.
Mm.
So it was also then the oracle for which the audible response was given to the high priest. Okay? So there is some significance of these things.
I don't think I ever heard of the golden censer.
Okay?
And I read my Bible through every year.
The censers, yes, you heard of these. Nadab and Abihu, you took every one of his censers.
Yeah.
Okay? And then there was some.
But I wouldn't have thought they were in the most holy place.
No, they weren't. They were in the holy place.
It says they were in the most holy place. This guy does.
No, he's just talking about,
He says the furniture of the tabernacle.
yeah, okay.
And the most holy place was the ark, the tables of testimony, the mercy.
Well,
seat,
there
and the golden
seems-
censer.
Yeah, there seems to be this, although when you read of it, you get some mixed about where
Maybe it was just left in there to be used or something.
you get, like I said, you're not always absolutely certain about what these things were used for. The censer used for burning of the daily incense on the golden altar. The golden altar then was made of brass. And they were severally called by the Hebrew incense, okay? This is a fire pan to take coals. Leviticus chapter 10 and verse 1, you see that? Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Eve,
Yes,
took either of them as censers, put fire therein,
that's right.
and fire thereon.
Well, they called for the censers when they did the Korah rebellion.
Yes, it was. But the censer was used for burning incense in the most holy place was, according to the Talmud, made of gold. And this seems to be in harmony with the testimony of Paul in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 4, when he speaks of the most holy place having a golden censer. All right. As well as the Ark of the Covenant. And that's what I'm telling you. It's not just absolutely set in stone by what's said, because it's not.
At the Korah rebellion, Aaron told them to bring, not Aaron, Eleazar, told them to bring, each man bring his censer.
Yeah.
So each household had a
A censer.
censer. Kind of like they had a banner and a.
All right, now, I think it was something different because they took those censers then, because they were holy, they made another covering for the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, but I'm telling you, this golden censer, there is not so much,
But it was in the most holy. It
well,
was golden.
and some people think that this is the ark, the incense, the altar of incense. And so you get into some, when you study this then from Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 4, you get into some, what exactly was this, okay? The design of all these things were partly commemorative and partly typical and partly for the sake of ornament, and partly to impress upon each successive generation by means of sensible design and symbols suitable ideas of God and of his government. All right. And then he's talking about the urn of manna, the pot of manna. And this was then this was the food supplied to the children of Israel for 40 years. Aaron's rod that budded, commemorated the rebellion of Korah and God's choice of Aaron's family for the priesthood. Now these other families, the Korah, was also from Aaron. Okay, so these families, then this family carried those most holy things on their shoulders, but they wanted to be.
They were grandchildren of Aaron.
They wanted to be up there with Aaron.
I
Okay.
didn't think their job was important.
Well, they wanted more power. Is what they wanted. They didn't think that they had enough power.
Yeah.
Here was here was.
That's when they brought all the censers out.
Yeah. All right. Then there was the ark, or the chest, of which the Shekinah rested, and we talked about that. God's throne, the symbol of God's throne. It contained the law, indicated that said the throne contains in itself the eternal principles of justice and righteousness. Okay. Then there were the tables, the Ten Commandments. Let's see, and hence the great symbolic beauty and fitness of the mercy seat, which is sprinkled with blood of atonement, covered the
Sprinkled
tabernacle.
mercy seat.
Yes. The tables of testimony as Christ now covers all testimony demands of law and justice against his people. The cherubim evidently represents angels who have ever looked with intense interest and wonder into the unfolding mysteries of redemption. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 12. How clearly then, how forceful are all these to serve and prove the divine origin of the Bible. Hebrews through in verse 5. All right, the furniture then of the holy place that's on the next page. You have three of these. You have the altar of incense, the table of showbread, and the candelabrum. So, table of the altar of incense. Okay, this stood directly before the veil. It was made of acacia wood overlaid with gold and was 2 cubits in height, 1 in length and 1 in breadth. And like the ark and the table, it had a crown or a rim or a cornice of gold round about its upper edges. It also had 4 rings of gold through which they placed 2 staves of acacia wood covered with gold, and it was the mean by which the Kohathites would carry these things. It also had 4 horns on it of projection corners covered with gold, which the high priest made atonement once a year. All right, on this altar, priest every evening and every morning offered sweet incense. All right, and it was made then of this, and they could not. These incense, and you see what he's talking about here, this could not be duplicated for any other purpose. If you wanted to duplicate this, you were guilty and you would be killed, because
They couldn't put these things together like this in the measurements.
that's right. That's right. This was explicitly for the use in this area, not for anything else. The altar, it seems to have had no further symbolic importance than simply to note that God has an appointed place. I think in Revelation it talks about the incense then represents the prayers of the saints, and he talks about that. The incense are the typical of the prayers of the saints. Revelation chapter 5, verse 8, and 8, verses 3 and 4. And that's what Revelation talks about then. All right, then the table of showbread. Next in the order, it's situated at the north side. Okay? So this is going to be on the east, this is going to be on the north. Situated on the north side of this table of showbread. Okay? And it stood then in the presence before the face of Jehovah. It was made of acacia wood, overlaid with gold. It was 2 cubits in length, 1 cubit in breadth, and 1.5 cubits in height. And like the ark and the altar, it had 4 rings, 2 staves, a cornice of pure gold. It had dishes and cakes, its cups, its for the frankincense and wine, its wine cups, and its libation cups were also of gold. These are some of the cups then that were taken out by Nebuchadnezzar and used then in that drunken feast in Daniel chapter 5. On this table placed every Sabbath by the high priest 12 cakes of fine flour, 6 in a row, and on each row a cup of frankincense. The cakes were eaten by the priest, and the frankincense were burned. Okay, this is also the cakes then that David got, and I think they were changing them out when David got them.
There was more frankincense. I'll let you smell some.
The symbolic meaning of these cakes is easily understood from its relation to the tabernacle as God's house. A well-furnished house always implies a table of provisions. I like that. All right. It is evident, therefore, that these 12 cakes were symbolic of the spiritual food of Christians. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And the Christian, he then talks about who are all priests to God. We'll get into that when he talks about the priest. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 5 and verse 9. The frankincense seems to have been emblematical of the praise and the thanksgiving. Now,
It's also one of the spices they brought to Jesus.
That's right. So it was then of high price. The candelabrum stood on the south side. So you had, then before the veil, you had the ark of the incense. Then north, you had table of showbread. And south, you had this candelabrum. Okay? And over against and it was then directly across from the table of showbread. Okay? It was wrought of beaten out of a talent of pure gold and consisted of one upright shaft and 6 branches, all ornamented with bowls and knops and flowers. Okay? And on these bowls, then they would put pure olive oil, and they would put a wick in there and light that, and it would burn. Okay. On top of the main stem was breech branch was the lamp. The snuffers and its snuff dishes were also of gold. That's what it talks about. These lamps then burn pure olive oil continually. And understand now, when Eli was old and Samuel was in there, his eyes got dim and the light went out. There's some significance of that too, because they were losing revelation and the presence of God until Samuel came on the scene, and then it was coming back because Eli let his boys just do whatever they wanted to do. The symbolic meaning of the candelabrum is very obvious. It is a type then of Christian church as God anointed means for the preserving and dispensing the light of the gospel. Okay. We are to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And that's what our job is. All right. It is evident from such passages as the following, and he gives some of those. It hence follows that every Christian congregation should be a light dispenser. Okay. And again, if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church, the pillar and the ground of the truth. Now, pillar and the ground does not change the truth. It just supports the truth. Truth's already been given. Now, observe that this was the only dispenser of light. There was no other light source in this tent. Its oil then produced it. The oil throughout the whole Bible is used as a common and appropriate symbol of the Holy Spirit. Okay. The 7 lamps then are symbol of the perfect light. And then he talks about Solomon's had 10 candelabras. How beautiful then, when all this harmonizes with the realities of the New Testament or the new
How
institution.
beautiful that was.
Yep. All right, now the court and its furniture. Okay, so now we've got outside the tent, okay, passing through the entrance veil or the hanging eastward. We next come to the court of the tabernacles. This is simply an enclosure of 100 cubits long, 50 cubits broad, surrounding by curtains of fine twine and 5 cubits high. And this is what the priests then were to guard. You couldn't enter into this court. You would be killed before you got to them. As a Gentile, we could not get that close to the tabernacle.
Could the other Jews come into this court? I thought they couldn't enter into the tabernacle.
No, they could not enter into the tabernacle. Only the priests could enter the tabernacle.
Right. But I know they have the court
now-
of the Gentiles and they have the court of the women.
And then we'll talk about that. He gets into that. The gate of the east of the hanging with 20 cubits and 5 cubits. The object of this enclosure was merely to separate the holy and the profane. It seems to be said to the unsanctified, as in the case of this fella, retire far hence, retire you profane, and quit entirely the sacred grove. None but the Israelites had the right to enter this court. So that answers your question. We're on page 132.
Oh, okay.
It's the top of the page. None but the Israelites had the right to enter this court. That's why I said the Gentile could not enter into this court. This is where the altar of burning, not incense, the burnt offerings were offered, and there was labor was also in this court too.
Does it say that?
Yeah, we'll get into it. It is much to be regretted, therefore, that in modern times this wall of separation between the sacred and profane, between the church and the world, has been in a great measure broken down, and in many cases almost obliterated. Oh man, if he would see this today, he would even have.
You would say it was already a little.
Yeah. All right, now here's Solomon's temple. There were two other courts. There's the inner court, the court of the priest. There were the outer courts. Now, the court of Herod's temple, then, there were the court of the priests, the court of the Israelites, the court of women, and the court of the Gentiles. Now, when he talks about the court of the women, he's talking about the Israelites. These were women who were Jews. This is not talking. Then you had the court of the Gentiles. This was one stadium nearly 1 furlong in length and the same in breadth, and completely surrounded all the other courts, but the greater portion of it lay to the south.
Well, this shows that he held Gentiles responsible, but furnishing them with a place to come to.
Well, I understand this is Herod's.
Oh, okay. It says Solomon's temple.
No.
Oh, okay. It was Herod's.
Okay.
All right, gotcha.
Now, the chief articles of the furniture in the court of the tabernacle were the laver and the altar of sacrifice. Okay. Now, the shape and the dimensions of the laver are not given in the scriptures, but is generally supposed to have been a circular basin of brass. Okay. And having its pedestal another shallower basin to receive the wastewater.
I thought Solomon's temple was supported by 12.
Well, we don't get ahead of us. These were both generally in circular form. The Septuagint has then a bathing tub. The water taken from the laver, and the priests were required under the penalty of death to wash both their hands and their feet, and they were barefooted, okay, when they went into the tabernacle.
You had to wear certain clothing too.
That's right. Hadn't got to there yet.
I know, but they had to. Did they put them on in the
Yes.
temple?
In
Tabernacle or?
it all depends. There's some
Mm.
they had to offer some sacrifices, and where they offered those sacrifices made a difference on where they changed their clothes.
Okay.
All right. The fundamental idea were symbolized in that of cleansing, and hence this washing was a beautiful type of the moral and spiritual purity that is required of all Christians. Now, he's got this asterisk. This asterisk is important. He says this does not represent then baptism. Okay, he says some do say that it represents baptism, but he gives then 4 reasons why he thinks, well, more than that. Why he says then that it is not. Okay?
So what, do you agree with him?
I have a tendency to agree with this. There's another aspect that he's going to talk about that talks about baptism.
Okay.
All right, because this is performed daily. But I have some things see, now go back up here. This was then the type of cleansing. All right, here's the blood of Christ, and what's it do?
Washes away your sin.
Okay, that's a type of cleansing, is it not?
Yes.
And then we as Christians, in 1 John chapter 1, verse 7, if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another. And the blood of Jesus Christ cleanseth us from all our sins. There's that continual contact with the blood of Christ. So there may be this idea of cleansing, and it's the idea of cleansing with the blood of Christ. Okay? All right. Now, number 4 down here, it says this washing was not designated to make men priests, but simply to qualify for daily duties. Okay? For the sacerdotal office. Now, notice that word sacerdotal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that is priestly office. That's what that means. Sacerdotal means priestly. Now, on the next page in the footnotes, okay, and we're going on with the thought then that this is there, that there was some analogy between these sacerdotal washings and Christian baptism, I freely admit. But he's saying there's a difference between types and analogies. They are symbol of an inward purity, as so also is baptism. Okay. Christ loved the church and gave himself for it that he might sanctify it. Titus chapter 3, by the works of, not by works of righteousness, which we have done, but according to his own mercy, he saved us. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 22, let's draw near with true heart, full assurance of faith, having our heart sprinkled from an evil conscience. These and other passages show very clearly that there is some analogy between sacerdotal washing of the law and Christian baptism. They both alike indicate necessity of inward purity, but it does not hence follow that it is former types of the latter. Then in the next paragraph, if there is an allusion or a typical reference to baptism of this washings, it is, I think, to be found in the washing of consecration. Exodus chapter 29:4, and Leviticus chapter 8, verse 6. Between this and the washing of regeneration, there is certainly several very direct striking points of analogy. The whole body was washed. Number one, the former was to be performed but once, as also is the latter. Number three, the former was part of the ceremony of consecration to the priest's office. All believers then are made kings and priests unto God. The former was followed by the sprinkling of blood and oil on the persons. All right, now let's go back. Okay, so he's talking about the fundamental symbol of cleansing. All right, so back on page 134, at the top of the page, he mentions Matthew chapter 5, verse 8, Hebrews 12:14, these passages. Psalms 24, 4 and 5. When in another question, who shall ascend to the hill of Jehovah, or who shall stand in his holy place? The reply is, they that have cleansed hands, pure heart, who hath not lifted up his soul unto vanity and sworn deceitfully, shall receive the blessings of Jehovah and the righteousness from God. Now, you talked about Solomon's temple. There were 10 lavers of brass and 1 sea. Now notice, this sea was 10 cubits in diameter, 30 in circumference, okay, and 5 in depth, containing, according to 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 26, 2,000 baths, or about 15,000 gallons. Now, 8.3 pounds per gallon, 15,000 gallons. I don't know what the average swimming pool is, but this is bigger than a swimming pool, okay? And according to 2 Chronicles chapter 4 and verse 5 and Josephus, it contained 3,000 baths, or about 22,500 gallons.
Deep as a swimming pool.
Yeah.
7.5 feet.
The latter estimate may refer to the actual capacity of the entire vessel, including the 12 oxen which supported it as the base, and the former may simply denote the quantity of water that is usually contained. This was the baths then, this sea was huge, okay? Now we have the altar of burnt offerings. This is one of those things that we need to know about. Because, and then we're going to get into the legal offerings here on the next thing, but the burnt offerings then, here's the altar. East of the laver then, in the court of the tabernacle, stood the altar of burnt offerings. It's called the brazen altar. It is made of acacia wood overlaid with brass. Everything else was overlaid with gold. This is overlaid with brass. Why didn't the wood burn up? Because
It's overlaid with brass,
it's, yes.
which is a good cooking instrument.
All right, the dimensions were 5 cubits. This thing was huge. 5 cubits long, 5 cubits broad, and 3 deep. And the altar of burnt offerings in Solomon's temple was 20 cubits in length and breadth and 10 in height. Do you understand how much they burnt on Solomon's temple that one time when they dedicated? It had to be red hot and had to continue that way in order to burn those animals that they were offering.
And be more than one burning going on at a time too, wouldn't you think?
Well,
I
yes,
mean, being that wide, if it was 20 cubits in length,
they had a
that's
big,
30 feet wide.
they had a big barbecue.
And they had 615,000 gallons of blood.
The utensils of the brazen altar were follows. Now, these are important too, okay? A lot of times we forget about this. There were horns on this altar too, and that were important. All right, there were pans or urns for receiving and carrying away the ashes that fell through the grating. There were shovels. This was for collecting the ashes and cleaning the altar. Now, they still did not let the fire go out. Once this thing was lit, it was lit and they had to carry it with the fire going.
Really?
And then there was the basin or the skins for receiving the blood of the victims and sprinkling it on the altar. There were flesh hooks, large forks, turning the pieces of flesh or for removing them from the fire. There were also incense or censers or fire pans for burning incense.
And the incense with those 4 herbs that they had named before, frankincense and
Yes, I think that's so. That was pretty much used throughout.
okay.
All right, within the boards, some distance from the top of the altar was suspended a network of brass. And on these, the sacrifices were consumed. And on this sacred fire was kept burning, ever kept burning. It was to never go out. So as they were carrying this thing about, then that fire had to be, okay. Kind of like what you remember when Abraham was offering Isaac. He said, here's the fire, here's the wood, but where's the sacrifice? Well, he had then some way of carrying fire.
Probably in one of those sensors things.
Well, this was back before that.
Yeah, they probably made
All right.
let me ask a question. Now, they made what, holy water, I'm using that.
No, they made holy water.
Yeah, they made holy water with the red heifer and the
All that.
burning outside the camp and had the ashes and they ran the water through and that was to ordain the priests, right?
We'll get into that.
But I mean, was
Yes.
it always done every time they had to ordain
Yes,
somebody?
they kept water. That was
Because I mean, as the men died and then they
retired.
retired, because they could only be a priest of 50, right? And then then the new ones came in, they had to do the ordination again.
We'll get into that.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'm just making sure.
But that they
It
had to
wasn't done
keep.
just one time.
No. And that holy water was used in other things. With a man accused his wife of indiscretion,
They used it to determine whether she
was lying or telling the truth,
but not
because he accused her. He was the one who accused her.
him. But what if she accused him?
It's never, that's,
Never mentioned?
never mentions that.
Because a woman could only have one husband, but a husband could have more than one wife.
Well, yes, in that case, but if he gave her a divorcement, she could remarry. But then if she did remarry, he couldn't take her back if something
When her
happened to
husband
that.
died, she went home to her daddy, right?
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
I have my own team.
All right. And now the next paragraph, he talks about some things there. And then like the golden, and it's interesting stuff about those. Like the golden altar and the brazen altar, this also had 4 rings and 2 staves and 4 horns. Okay. Now you think about the folks that had to carry that. Okay. Now this primarily served as God's appointed place for the offering of sacrifices.
That altar could have been put on a cart,
Nope.
though. Oh, I thought it was.
No,
Because
sorry.
it was not part of the
Yes.
holy place
Yes,
because it's in the court.
that's right. It still had these rings on it to be carried by the priest.
I said, well,
That's why from 30 to 50 is the only time that they could carry this.
oh,
Okay.
okay.
All right. Let's see. Is God's appointed place for sacrifice? But it is always here that God first met with the sinner on terms of reconciliation and pardon. It became an object of the most profound interest to every Israelite. Okay? The horns of this altar seem to have been a symbol of power and divine protection. Okay, when Solomon became king, one of the captains of the army went in and grabbed hold of these horns. And Solomon told his man to go in there and kill him.
Because he touched
No, because
it, he grabbed the horn.
no, because it was his time to die, and he had done something you have to go and read what happened when Solomon became king. But there was, all right. But he grabbed these horns. And hence it is pretty clearly that intimidated by the horns of the altar and the brimstone, it was only by means of prayer and the blood of atonement the sinner could prevail before God. The fire on the altar seems to represent God's administrative justice, which accepts the victim in lieu of the sinner. Okay, the sacrificial. Now, in this next one, he's going to talk about the legal offerings. So we're going to get into some of these legal offerings, and I think they're pretty. And in these offerings, we're going to see, because now, what if I just close after we go over them and close my book, now you got to go offer these sacrifices. Can you remember every sacrifice and every time you need? That's the difficulty of this Old Testament. Okay, the Old Testament is because you had to remember these things when you could offer them, when you didn't, how you did it. Not only when, but how, because they had certain things they had to do. Okay. And before we get into this, look at the bottom of the page. He has then a difference between an offering and a sacrifice. It's simply this: the latter is the species of the former. All sacrifices are offering, but not all offerings are sacrifices. And I think that would be key to know. Okay?
That's true.
A sacrifice always implies, now listen to this, a sacrifice always implies of necessity a real change or destruction of the thing offered. But everything presented to God, whether changed or unchanged, was called an offering or an oblation. And hence the word commonly used by the Hebrews to denote a sacrifice, then, to slaughter. The word most, okay, and he gets into that. But I want you to understand the difference between a sacrifice and an offering.
Give us an example
A sacrifice?
of an offering and a sacrifice, like what we would do today.
Well, we're to change. That would be, okay, Romans.
The sacrifice would be like giving up your old life.
Yes. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Okay.
All right. So that is because here is the change then that's involved.
Okay.
All right. Now we offer then an offering to God every first day of the week.
Yes.
When we give our money, we call that an offering.
Yes.
Okay. So there it doesn't change. It's not, it may change hands, but it doesn't, it's still that type of thing. But there's no, that's an
I
offering.
always thought of a sacrifice more of a loss, that you give up something.
All right. That's what he's talking about. Here's the change or destruction.
Right.
And so
In
it
other
all
words, you
depends.
give up your former life to be a child
That's a
of God.
change. Yeah.
That's a change, and you're also giving it up.
Yeah. And there's a destruction
But the offering could be something that you have as a child of God,
that you offer to God.
that you offer to God, like your time.
Right.
But he calls it our sacrifice of our lips, doesn't he?
He calls it the sacrifice. Hebrews
How could
13.
the singing be a sacrifice?
Well, I think that's a,
I
yes.
could think of it more of an offering than I would a sacrifice.
Where's Hebrews at?
It's toward the middle of your list.
Towards the back. Hebrews chapter 13, 15, isn't it?
Yeah,
Let's offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually. That is the fruit of our lips. I don't know that I think the sacrifice there is talking about then worship to God. That's not the only place that Christians are to sacrifice then. I think that's talking about worship. You'd have to go and look at the Greek word there.
just interesting.
Yep. All right, so here is the oldest then, and the most comprehensive of the legal system is talking about the burnt offerings. It was offered not only for partial or sacrifice of sins, but it was also the case of the daily burnt offerings for sins in general. All right, this goes back a long way. This is even then in the patriarchal, they offered burnt offerings. The victim might have been a bullock, a ram, a goat, a dove, or a pigeon. All right, but in all cases, the law required that it should be a male without blemish. Now, there were also voluntary and required sacrifices, burnt offerings. Okay? Now, the last thing, in every case, it didn't make any difference. There were the person who was offering laid his hands on its head and killed it.
Not the priest, the owner.
Well, under the oversight of the priest. The priest would do
Well, the
that.
priest would take it then and do the offering, right?
Turn over to page 138. That's what he said. The priest then sprinkled all the blood around about the altar and burned the whole victim. Now understand, burned the whole victim.
I wish you would use one.
Well, that's what he's,
I know, but a cow's not a victim.
well, that's what he
I
uses.
said he wish you
Well, I'm sorry, but that's what he's using.
would. I
Okay.
don't think about a cow.
Well,
Person, yes. Christ, yes.
everything then but the skin. And the skin was the priest's portion.
So they got like cracklings and stuff.
They got, no, the skin.
Cracklings are guts, right?
Cracklings are the fat.
Oh, okay.
They didn't get the
Skin is
fat.
like hog skins, like
It's, you know,
potato chips.
like you know. Well,
Except the skin.
except the skin.
We'll just accept it like that.
They did not offer pigs because pigs are unclean.
I know.
So they didn't offer them. Everything they offered had to have a skin, just like a cow. You skin it.
They didn't eat catfish. That's skin.
Well, I understand that too, but they still skin. There's no place where they offered fish for sacrifices.
Fish didn't die during that war.
All right, and hence, let's see. He's got this is interesting. It's an ascension. It's commonly given to the kind of sacrifice because it is consumed, because its consumption, most of it was made to ascend towards heaven. So it was totally burned up.
Oh, I understand.
All right, now the sin sacrifice. Now Christ then, Christ's sacrifice
The sins.
is in all of these, and all pointed to the sacrifice of Christ. Okay? The law of this sacrifice is found in Leviticus, mine's messed up, 4, 5,
4, 5.
and 6. Okay? This sacrifice seems to have been unknown before the time of Moses. And it's first named in Exodus 29:14. And its name, sin, implies, as has been the case, had in all cases special reference then to sin, something more defined and specific than the burnt offerings, and the meat offerings seem to have been necessary under it, an institution that was added on account of sin, till the seed should come, Galatians 3:19. And hence we find that it was generally required on particular occasions and for particular sins. For instance, it was required when the priests were consecrated. Right? When mothers had childbirth, when lepers were healed, when the Nazarites were unexpectedly contaminated. Now, this next paragraph is also important. The kind of victim that was required depended on the rank and the ability of the person who offered it. The particular circumstances of the case. It might be a young bullock, okay, a male kid or a female kid or lamb. How expensive? You think about then a young bullock. How expensive is a bullock?
$1,800.
Somewhere around in there.
Least amount.
Here's a male kid. So if you had the money then, here's what you would offer. A kid then, or a female, a lamb, a dove, or a pigeon. And now listen, in the case of extreme poverty, the 10th part of an ephah, or about 7 pints of fine flour, was accepted in lieu of 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons.
That's what Mary gave.
That's what. All right. Now we go back over here to number 2 as of mothers of childbirth. And here's what Mary offered. She offered. So that shows you how close she was to being absolutely abject poverty. She offered 2 young pigeons. Okay. She was. Their next level was then the ephah. That shows you then that when the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh did not happen until after 8 days, because she would have offered some of those sacrifices rather than the 2 young pigeons. Okay. In all cases, the sinner was required to lay his hand on the head of the victim and to confess his sins and then to kill the sacrifice. If the whole congregation had sinned, the elders were required to act as their representative. The high priest then took the blood of its victim. If it were a bullock for himself and for the congregation, he sprinkled a portion of it 7 times before the inner veil and put some of it on the horns of the golden altar, and then poured out the remainder at the foot of the brazen altar. Let me tell you something. That was not the place to stand at the foot of the brazen altar because of all the blood that was poured out there. In most other cases, he first put some blood on the horns of the brazen altar and then poured the rest at its foot. The fat was then burned on the altar of burnt offerings, and the flesh was either wholly consumed by fire without the camp. Okay, now they had to have a place outside the camp where this thing could be offered, or it was eaten by the priest in the holy place.
The fat belonged to God.
What?
The fat?
Oh, yeah. So it was eaten in the holy place. What represents the holy place?
Church.
Okay, so we can eat in the.
Church.
Okay, thank you very much.
Building.
The law required that if any of the blood of the victim had been taken to the sanctuary, then the flesh had to be burned without the camp. Where was-
Wasn't there like a gully around the altar
No, I don't know about that. It doesn't say. But where was Jesus offered?
outside the camp?
Outside the camp. Okay. Now the trespass offering. Okay. Trespass offering is to be found in Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 7. This offering was very nearly related to the sin offering, and it was, in fact, a sort of supplement or appendix to it. Like the sin offering, it was required for specific offenses. But unlike the sin offering, it had not reference to sin in the absolute, but only in subordinate and civil relations, and hence it was required only for such against God or man as admitted by some estimation or recompense. Okay? It wasn't offered just in for anything. You had the sin offering. This was a
That
trespassing.
was any kind of sin.
That's right. And you had to, that was for a specific sin. This is, and then
Only this kind of sin.
for only for such sins against God or man as admitted by some estimation or recompense. So if I stole from you
Mhm.
All right. Here's one of the sacrifices. Then I had to offer a trespass offering.
Okay.
Not only did I have to restore that, but I had to offer this sacrifice too.
Right, oh,
Yes. Then I had to offer this sacrifice for myself.
Okay. Okay.
So-
What would be an example of, would you do both?
You may have to,
The sin offering?
and the trespass offering.
Okay, because depending on what kind of sin.
That's right. So see, not
I
only
thought all sin was against God.
it is. Okay. We're going to start right there next week.
Right.
All right. We're going to talk about the sin offering. Start all over with the sin offering. All right.